Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at Indigenous peoples and some of the major challenges confronting them, such as climate change, poverty, educational issues, and many others. My guest today is an expert on these particular problems. My guest today is Mr. Brian Keane. Brian Keane has been working with Indigenous communities around the world for nearly 3 decades. He is the co-founder of the international organization Land is Life, and he is currently serving as an advisor for Indigenous peoples issues for the USAID Department. Mr. Keane is the Rapporteur for the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues sessions that recently concluded. Mr. Brian Keane, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to get into the special rapporteur in just a moment, but let's talk about the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. What exactly is the purpose of that, the concept and the mission?
So the Permanent Forum was created in 2001 as an advisory body to the Economic and Social Council. So we provide guidance to the Economic and Social Council. We provide guidance and recommendations to all UN agencies, funds, programs through the Economic and Social Council. And the forum meets for 2 weeks every year. And we discuss 6 mandated areas: health, education, human rights, culture, environment, and one I'm blanking on.
Infrastructure or something like that, perhaps?
Social and economic development.
Oh,
yeah.
There we go. Close enough.
And then we have a special theme every year. This year the special theme was Indigenous peoples' collective rights to lands, territories, and resources. Mm-hmm. And so out of the forum comes a report that goes to the Economic and Social Council, and that report has recommendations to all of the UN bodies, like I said, and to some governments, and to some international financial institutions.
I see. Now, you were the rapporteur
Yes.
for this particular session. What is the role of the rapporteur?
So I was rapporteur this year and last year. So I'm responsible for writing the report. There's 16 members on the forum. This session and last session, there's only been 15, but I'm responsible for bringing everybody together to get consensus on every sentence that's in the report, basically. So it's the report's approved by consensus, so we need to get everybody on board with everything we say.
Now, our viewers can go to www.indigenous.org to get more information from the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which is part of the United Nations system. So if people are looking for more information, they could go there.
Yeah, they can get past reports. They can get, every year, the Permanent Forum hosts a expert group meeting on different subjects related to Indigenous peoples. This year it was sustainable development in the territories of Indigenous peoples. In January, we'll hold one that will be on conservation and the rights of Indigenous peoples. So they can get those reports from those expert group meetings, and also each year the forum members do between 1 and 3 reports, and those are all there too for the past 17 years. Yeah, we just finished the 17th session of the forum.
Now, I believe the official statistics of the United Nations is there are about 370 to 400 million Indigenous peoples around the world out of the 7.4 billion people. We hear that term Indigenous. When I hear that, I just, being a novice in this area, I just think of the original inhabitants of a particular geographical area. How do you define Indigenous? Is it broader than that?
It is. That's a pretty good definition, but there's no agreed to definition, but there's a group of criteria that the UN has developed over the years. It was developed by Professor Martinez Cobo, and that is internationally recognized definition, I guess you'd call it, which would be distinct peoples. They have their distinct languages, distinct social systems, distinct decision-making processes, and they have they self-identify as different, and they have a strong connection to the lands that they live on, the lands and the resources.
So it's a much broader definition.
Yeah, it's a bit broader, but in most cases, they're the original people of an area.
Yeah. Well, flashing back several years now, I guess, to 2014, one of the recommendations that came out of one of the forums was to have enhanced participation in the work of the UN. What exactly did they mean by that, and why was it important?
Okay, so in 2014, there was a high-level event with the General Assembly of the United Nations called the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, and it brought governments and indigenous peoples from around the world together to see if they could find a way to move forward with the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is basically spells out what indigenous peoples, the minimum standards that indigenous peoples need to continue surviving as distinct peoples. And one of the things that came out on the outcome document of that World Conference of Indigenous Peoples was the need for enhanced participation of indigenous peoples within the UN system. So some people want to see observer status in the General Assembly, participation in all the ECOSOC meetings and its subsidiary bodies. So there's different levels of participation. What's clear is that indigenous peoples need a stronger voice in the UN. They have a lot to offer to the work of the UN. You know, this is where governments get together to try to solve some of the world's most pressing problems, and indigenous peoples have a lot to offer, whether we're talking about climate change, biodiversity protection, conflict, all of those things. And so so now indigenous peoples are still pushing for a greater role in the UN, enhanced participation, but so far there has been no agreement with government. Some governments support enhanced participation, some governments seem to be blocking that. Yeah.
And of course the UN is made up of 193 governments, so
Yes.
it's a governmental organization.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Of course, now do the indigenous peoples, do they have regional representation, or do they do regional meetings together? I know they come to the UN every year. You have a large number in attendance at your forum, but do they have any type of regional activities for collaboration, coordination, input into the decision-making processes?
Yeah, there's all kinds of regional meetings going on all the time, sometimes to discuss UN issues, but other times to discuss regional issues of the Americas or of Africa, sometimes national issues. You'll have indigenous peoples getting together within one country to push for recognition in the country's constitution or for certain laws that will recognize their land rights and things like that. So there's a lot of networking that's been going on for a long time amongst indigenous peoples, and they've achieved quite a bit with that.
Now, one area that's under pressure, a lot of areas that are under pressure, but one in particular is with languages. Not too long ago, we heard from the linguistic experts there were like 6,000 languages around the world. Now, some of them were only spoken by 5 or 6 people, but there were still 6,000 languages. But we hear that those are diminishing and declining, I'm not going to say on a daily basis, but quite frequently. How serious is this, and how does that tie into 2019 being the International Year of Indigenous Language?
Yeah, so...
Or languages.
Yeah. I think the statistic is that one language disappears every 2 weeks. And those languages are important for the peoples whose language that is. For the youth, you have a lot of indigenous youth in these communities where language is being forgotten, and that brings a lot of identity problems and things like that. You know, but also, in addition to that, each time a language disappears, we're losing sort of incalculable pharmacological knowledge, medical knowledge, spiritual knowledge, ecological knowledge. You know, these languages come from a place, and if we want to, as a matter of fact, if you look at the health of a language, that's the best indicator for the health of an ecosystem. So if an indigenous people is from certain part of the Amazon. If their language is intact, then you can be sure that their ecosystem is doing pretty good, the biodiversity is doing pretty good, the forest is doing pretty good. It's one of the best indicators. So, because in that language is sort of the clues of how you manage that ecosystem. Not the clues, but the knowledge. The knowledge is in the language. So it's important that 2019 is the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and we hope that it will inspire countries to work with Indigenous peoples to take the necessary steps to protect languages. You know, and just one more thing on languages, like here in the United States or in Canada, sometimes you have communities where few people speak the language, and the focus is on language revitalization. Right? And in other areas, it's a much different scenario. For like in the Amazon, you could have communities now where 100% of the people speak the language, but they're under such threat from different actors, development, illegal logging, illegal mining, that in 10, 15 years, that 100% could be down to 15%. It could happen like that, and so there's a lot to strategize about how we're going to protect Indigenous languages, and hopefully this international year will get some of those, get some new programs, new efforts moving towards protecting these languages.
And you mentioned the pharmacological discoveries too. So often we forget that a lot of the medicines and the remedies and the herbs and whatever come out of the Amazon jungle, the river basin in that area, come out of the jungle of Indonesia,
Right.
Different places like that. And they are under tremendous pressure, especially the Amazon, which is the lungs of the earth as far as helping to absorb some of the CO2 and that type of thing. And there's so much destruction taking place with, like you mentioned, illegal logging, the developing of farms, that the soil becomes leached in a year or two because of the torrential rains. How severe is that problem?
It's pretty severe with climate change too. So, in some parts of the Amazon, you have the cattle ranching. So you get big cattle ranchers going in and just clear cutting forest, and so the cattle can graze and forcing the indigenous peoples off of their land. You've got palm oil plantations, you've got illegal and legal mining, oil development, construction of hydroelectric dams, industrial agriculture. Those are all things that are impacting not just the Amazon, but the people that live in the Amazon and who have been protecting the Amazon for thousands of years. So it's a big issue. And, with the medicine, I think most of the world's people depend on non-Western medicine. So if you go to the Amazon, to a little town on the outskirts, and there's people there who aren't from the Amazon, many of them go to the local medical practitioners, that use the herbs and things to cure people. So as you get cutting down these forests, and whether it's the Amazon or in Indonesia, all of this medicine is disappearing, and AIDS is scary, but AIDS' little brother is around the corner with climate change and everything, and he's a lot scarier. So all these new diseases that we're seeing and will continue to be seeing, these drug-resistant bacteria and things like that, we're going to need all the medicines that we can. So that's another reason why it's important to.
We certainly will. And as we see with all these international issues, they have local impacts, and we don't realize it so often, but they do. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps you're involved with an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup or an intra-campus website, or you just have a website and you'd like to help share our programs, please feel free to do so. Global Connections is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our local lives. Today we're taking a look at the indigenous peoples and some of the major challenges that are confronting them, such as climate change, educational, health, and many others. My guest today is an expert on these issues. My guest today is Mr. Brian Keane. Mr. Brian Keane is the Rapporteur for the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. We were talking, Brian, about you mentioned climate change. This, in the opinion of many experts, this is the number one challenge affecting us. The indigenous peoples have firsthand knowledge of climate change. We all see it. We read about the glaciers melting, we read about desertification. But how are they confronting this? I know it's different from one area to another, but I would dare to say every human is being affected, but certainly every indigenous person is being adversely affected by climate change. Would you think?
Yes, and I think that it's more, a lot of people, say in the United States or developed countries, don't feel as if they're affected because they can go to the grocery store and get their food and things like that. But indigenous peoples are dependent on their environment for their food, their medicine, and so they are impacted, kind of before everybody else, so they're feeling the impacts before everybody else. And I think that when we talk about trying to respond to the challenges that are presented by global climate change, we need to, we hear a lot about technology, and we hear a lot about carbon trading and things like that. So technology has a role to play, but there's no silver bullet that's going to solve climate change. Carbon trading may have a role to play, but it's not, it's a very limited role, and from what I've seen, it hasn't been proven to really be effective right now. So we need to reduce consumption of fossil fuels, and to maintain the ecological or climatic stability of the planet, we need to protect these large landscapes that still exist, protect their integrity. So we have rainforests that still exist in some areas. We have other kinds of landscapes that exist in other areas. And the only areas we can find these intact landscapes are where indigenous peoples have maintained control of their territories. So the biggest thing we can do to confront climate change is recognize the rights of indigenous peoples to their lands and their resources, because they've been maintaining that equilibrium for thousands of years, and as those large ecosystems continue to be destroyed, the climate's going to get worse and worse.
When you said the rights, it brought to mind the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons. What exactly is that?
So it's the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yeah, we're talking about collective rights here. So basically, when the UN, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, there were some indigenous leaders trying to get their issues heard during that process, but they weren't heard. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a great and necessary document, but it doesn't adequately address some of the issues of concern to indigenous peoples, and that is collective rights. So if you were to sort of do indigenous rights in a nutshell, it would be the right to self-determination and the right to collective ownership of lands, resources, and knowledge. And the knowledge goes back to the medicine. For example, that's not the extent of the knowledge, but that's part of it. So over about 23 years, indigenous peoples and governments negotiated the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It expresses the minimum standards necessary for indigenous peoples to continue to survive as distinct peoples. It recognizes the right to self-determination, to control their own development priorities, to control their resources, their education, their health. And in 2007, the declaration was adopted by the UN General Assembly. So it's been in effect now for about 11 years. And we've seen gains in some areas, but there still needs to be a lot more effort put into implementing the ideals that are expressed in the declaration.
That's a good point. Are there some best practices, or where are some of the gains, and where are the areas we need to look at the losses and maybe try to make gains out of them.
Yeah. So the gains are pretty much every country in Latin America, if not every country in Latin America, now recognizes indigenous peoples and recognizes their rights either in their constitutions or in laws. On the ground, those laws and constitutions are not always implemented. So that's a problem. Oil companies are still able to get leases to oil fields on indigenous peoples' territories without the consent of the indigenous peoples. Things like that are, and mining companies, things like that are happening still. Other gains in Africa, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights has made some decisions very favorable for indigenous peoples. Some of the African countries are starting to recognize indigenous peoples. And then you have gains in the international political arena, like the creation of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. The United Nations now has a special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. The Human Rights Council has a subsidiary body called the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we're seeing a global conversation right now on indigenous people's rights that 20, 25 years ago, most people didn't know what you meant if you said indigenous peoples. So there's a lot of gains on paper and in laws, in jurisprudence. There is a gap, though, in implementation of those. So we're seeing the same problems we were seeing 25, 30 years ago with indigenous people sort of being seen as obstacles to development and being thrown off of their lands for large agricultural projects, hydroelectric dams, oil, mining, all of that stuff.
And that's certainly, well, you mentioned most indigenous peoples, or a large number, they have a communitarian concept. They're a part of a community, whereas you look at an extractive oil industry, they're more rugged individualists can come in and exploit the land, the oil, and leave.
Right.
And if it's ruined, that's in many cases too bad.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that shouldn't be that way, but it is. But that seems like it'd be quite a clash of cultures and also of economic interest. And assuming that the indigenous peoples are losing ground in more ways than one in this battle. Are they not, or are they making gains and we're starting to realize that their rights should be preserved, and perhaps there's some peaceful coexistence with extractive industries or large hydroelectric projects or something like that?
Yeah, well, indigenous peoples aren't against development. They just want a development that is not destructive. They know that if they leave their lands and join the other system, the dominant system, they don't go in as doctors and lawyers and stuff. They go in at the bottom of the bottom rung, and there's not much opportunity to move up. And also, once they leave their lands or get kicked off of their lands, that's sort of the destruction of their culture, and with that comes all kinds of other issues, social issues. And so indigenous peoples feel like they have the right, and they do, it's been recognized by the states that make up the United Nations, to their own forms of development. I think it's fair to say that business as usual has contributed in no small part to a lot of the problems we were just discussing, climate change and destruction of forests and things like that. So we need to think of how we can create space in our thinking about development that has room for indigenous models of development, which aren't based on just resource extraction, and we need to recognize and respect that these people have the right to their own development. They can choose where they want to be in 50 years or 100 years. And I'd say in pretty much every case, that's not, with a pocket full of cash in New York. They want to be on their lands,
of course. Exactly.
so that their grandchildren and their grandchildren's grandchildren will still have the resources necessary to survive, with their culture
Exactly.
intact. Yeah.
Well, Brian Keane, this is a fascinating area, and it's a very important area, and one we need to certainly learn much more about. But I want to thank you for bringing us up to date on many of the issues confronting Indigenous peoples around the world. Again, 400 million plus, or 400 million, or roughly 400 million are affected. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.